The airplane cabin buzzed with the low hum of settling passengers, the rhythmic shuffle of feet on the carpeted aisle, and the soft chime of seatbelt reminders overhead. It was an early morning flight from Chicago to New York, one of those busy business routes where half the travelers wore suits, carried sleek laptops, and spoke in tired voices about meetings, deadlines, and presentations. The other half were tourists or families, people clutching travel pillows, neck rests, and small bags of snacks bought at airport kiosks. Amid the flow of bodies and rolling carry-ons, a tall black man in his mid-30s, neatly dressed in a light gray blazer and navy blue trousers, paused at row 14. He glanced at his ticket and then at the seat beside the window, 14A. With a polite smile, he lifted his bag into the overhead compartment, careful not to bump anyone, and sat down quietly, adjusting his seatbelt. He looked composed, confident, the kind of person who carried dignity in his posture. His name was Marcus Bryant, a software engineer traveling to New York for a conference where he was scheduled to speak about artificial intelligence and ethics in technology. He had given similar talks before, but this one mattered. It was being recorded for a national audience. Just as Marcus opened his book and began to read, a woman appeared beside his row. She was middle-aged, maybe in her 50s, with neatly curled blonde hair, pearl earrings, and a crisp, cream-colored blouse. She carried herself with the air of someone used to getting her way, the kind of confidence that often came with privilege or perhaps entitlement. She checked the number on her boarding pass, 14B, then froze. Her eyes darted to Marcus, then back to the seat, and a visible stiffness crossed her face. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "Excuse me," she said sharply, turning to the flight attendant nearby, a young woman named Elena, who was helping passengers find their seats. "There must be some mistake. I'm supposed to sit here." Elena smiled, accustomed to small confusions like this. "Yes, ma'am," she said kindly. "This is seat 14B, right next to 14A. You're in the right spot." But the woman didn't move. Her expression hardened. "I can't sit here," she said quietly, but firmly enough that Marcus heard her. He looked up, a faint crease forming on his forehead. Elena blinked, confused. "I'm sorry?" The woman took a half-step back, lowering her voice as if to keep it discreet, though her tone was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I don't want to sit next to him." She didn't say black man, but the meaning hung heavy in the air. The words didn't need to be said. The tension said it for her. A few passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, sensing the discomfort. Marcus stayed still, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize the signs. The subtle recoil, the avoidance, the whispered tone pretending to be polite but soaked in prejudice. He'd learned over years of quiet endurance to respond with calm. He closed his book and looked at Elena, giving her a gentle nod that seemed to say, "It's okay. Handle it however you need to." But inside, a small knot formed in his chest, that old familiar ache of being judged before being known. Elena hesitated. She had dealt with all kinds of passengers, nervous flyers, angry ones, parents juggling toddlers, but this was different. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her. She took a slow breath. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "this is your assigned seat. The flight is full today. I'm afraid I can't move you unless there's an open seat available." The woman frowned, her face reddening slightly. "Well, then find one," she said curtly. "There must be something. I just don't feel comfortable sitting here." The moment stretched, thick with unease. Marcus didn't speak. He knew anything he said could be twisted, misunderstood, or used against him. He just sat, composed, his hands folded on his lap. Elena excused herself to check the seating chart on her tablet. The woman stood in the aisle, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. A man across the aisle muttered something under his breath, something like, "Unbelievable." A young couple 2 rows back exchanged glances. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier. After a minute, Elena returned. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said softly. "Every seat is occupied. There's nowhere to move you." The woman's jaw tightened. "Then maybe he can move," she said, motioning slightly toward Marcus without looking directly at him. That did it. The murmurs grew louder now, disapproval rippling through the cabin. One passenger shook his head. Another whispered, "Disgraceful." Elena's face changed subtly, her professional smile fading into something colder, sterner. She straightened her posture, the authority of her uniform settling in. "Ma'am," she said, her voice firmer now. Mr. Bryant has every right to sit in his assigned seat. We don't move passengers based on personal prejudice. I'll ask you again to take your seat so we can depart on time. For a heartbeat, silence filled the space, the kind of silence that precedes a moral reckoning. The woman looked around, suddenly aware that people were watching her, that her indignation was no longer private but exposed. She flushed with embarrassment and muttered, "This is ridiculous," but she still didn't sit down. Marcus simply looked out the window, the reflection of the clouds beginning to form on the glass. And so, the flight waited. An entire plane suspended in an awkward standoff, all because one woman refused to sit next to a man whose only offense was the color of his skin. The tension in the cabin had turned into something palpable, a thick, uneasy quiet that wrapped around everyone like a fog. You could hear the faint hiss of the air vents, the soft clicking of overhead compartments being shut, and somewhere in the back, a baby's muffled cry. But most passengers weren't paying attention to any of that. Their eyes were on row 14, where one woman's prejudice had stalled an entire plane. Marcus sat still, his composure unbroken, though inside he could feel the heavy weight of every glance, every whispered conversation. He'd faced racism before, in stores, in boardrooms, even in his own neighborhood. But something about this moment, the publicness of it, the quiet humiliation of being treated as less than human in front of dozens of strangers, cut deeper. Yet he said nothing. His mother had once told him, "Son, sometimes silence speaks louder than anger. Let your dignity do the talking." And so, he waited. Elena, the flight attendant, could feel her heart beating a little faster. She'd been trained to handle emergencies, turbulence, medical crises, mechanical delays, but no one really trained you for this. Racism wasn't in the manual. It wasn't in the safety briefing. But it was real. And in that moment, she knew she had a decision to make. One that would define the tone of that flight, and maybe, in some small way, restore a bit of faith in humanity. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform jacket, and gave the woman a look that was neither angry nor apologetic, just firm, the look of someone who had decided to stand on principle. "Ma'am," she said clearly, "we cannot and will not change another passenger's seat because of your discomfort with who they are. If you refuse to take your assigned seat, we'll have to ask you to disembark the plane." The woman blinked in disbelief, her mouth opening slightly. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising a little. "I paid for this ticket. I'm a frequent flyer on this airline." Her indignation was starting to spill over, her voice echoing down the aisle. "I'm not the one causing trouble here. I just don't think it's right that I should be forced to sit next to—" She stopped herself just before saying it, but the implication was clear enough. A few passengers gasped quietly, others shook their heads in disgust. A young man in the seat ahead turned around and said sharply, "Lady, sit down already. You're the only problem here." The woman glared at him, clutching her purse tighter. Elena's tone never wavered. "Ma'am, this isn't about your frequent flyer status or your ticket price. This is about basic respect. Every passenger on this aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity. You can either take your seat and enjoy the flight, or I'll call security to assist you off the plane. The choice is yours." The professionalism in her voice made it clear. She wasn't bluffing. Elena had seen enough in her years of service to know that allowing one act of discrimination unchecked would send the wrong message to everyone watching. The cabin was silent again, waiting for the woman's response. Marcus sat quietly, eyes fixed on the book in his lap, though he wasn't reading a single word. He admired Elena's courage. It wasn't easy to confront prejudice so openly, especially in front of a crowd. He thought about speaking up, maybe saying something to ease the tension, but then he decided not to. This moment wasn't about defending himself. It was about watching how people chose to respond to hate, whether they looked away, stayed silent, or stood up. And Elena, he realized, had chosen to stand up. The woman looked around, her face flushed, her eyes darting from one onlooker to another, searching for someone to back her up. No one did. Even those who usually avoided conflict were united in quiet disapproval. The man across the aisle folded his arms, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered again. The couple 2 rows back whispered something about some people never learning. The woman's bravado began to crumble. Her lips trembled, her shoulders stiffened. For the first time she looked small, not because anyone humiliated her, but because the mirror of truth had been held up to her, and she didn't like what she saw. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to keep the conversation professional. I understand this might not be the seat you hoped for, but we cannot allow discrimination on this flight. Mr. Bryant has done absolutely nothing wrong. If you continue to refuse your seat, I'll have to inform the captain and we'll need to remove you from the aircraft. Please, let's not make this harder than it has to be. Her words were calm but decisive, the kind of tone that comes from moral clarity. For a long moment, the woman didn't move. Then, slowly, she let out an exasperated sigh. Fine, she said sharply, almost spitting the word. She shoved her bag into the overhead compartment, sat down abruptly in 14B, and turned her face toward the aisle, making sure her body language said, "Don't talk to me." Marcus didn't react. He simply turned back toward the window, the faintest trace of a weary smile flickering across his face, not out of victory, but out of relief. The ordeal, at least for now, was over. Elena gave Marcus a small nod. A silent gesture of respect and apology rolled into one. He nodded back, understanding completely. The flight attendant then addressed the rest of the cabin with professionalism restored, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. The tension didn't dissolve instantly, but slowly, like a fog lifting after a storm. People went back to their conversations, their magazines, their phones. But something had shifted. The passengers had witnessed something raw, uncomfortable, and deeply human. And most of them, silently, admired the courage it took for one woman in uniform to draw a line where it mattered most. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Marcus leaned his head against the window. The morning sun reflected off the wing, golden light flooding through the cabin. He thought about how, even in 2025, prejudice still found its way into the most ordinary moments. A flight, a seat, a glance. But he also thought about how courage and kindness still lived in people like Elena, people who refused to let hate have the last word. For the first time since boarding, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over him. As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the runway, the cabin trembled with that familiar vibration that always accompanied takeoff, that moment when gravity loosened its grip, and the world below began to shrink into a patchwork of clouds and skyline. For most passengers, it was routine, but for Marcus, it was symbolic. Every ascent reminded him of progress, of rising above, not just physically, but emotionally and morally too. He'd long ago learned that the higher you climb, the smaller ignorance looks from above. He adjusted his seatbelt slightly, trying to relax, though the tension from the earlier confrontation still lingered like a shadow. Beside him, the woman sat stiffly, arms crossed, her gaze locked forward, refusing to even glance in his direction. Her name, as printed on her boarding pass that Marcus had glimpsed earlier, was Margaret Hensley. She seemed like someone used to control, used to the world bending to her expectations. But now, for the first time in a long time, she found herself isolated by her own prejudice. For the first 20 minutes of the flight, no words passed between them. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Elena, the flight attendant, walked down the aisle checking seatbelts and offering drinks. When she reached row 14, she hesitated for a fraction of a second. She looked at Marcus first. "Coffee, tea, or water, sir?" she asked, her tone warm, respectful. "Just water, please," he replied with a polite smile. Then she turned to Margaret. "And for you, ma'am?" Margaret didn't look up. "Coffee," she said curtly. Elena nodded, handed her the cup, and moved on. But as she passed, Marcus caught the faintest glimmer of approval in her eyes. The silent kind of thanks that didn't need words. Marcus unscrewed his water bottle cap and took a slow sip. He tried to return to his book, but the earlier encounter kept replaying in his mind. Not because it was unusual, sadly it wasn't, but because it happened in a space where everyone could see. Most racism he'd experienced had been quieter, coded, dressed up in politeness. But this was naked. He wondered if Margaret had children or grandchildren. Did they think like her? Or had the world moved on without her, leaving her stranded in a mindset that no longer belonged? Part of him wanted to pity her. Another part wanted to forget she even existed. But the truth was, people like her were the reason conversations about race still mattered. Margaret, on the other hand, was battling her own turmoil. Though her face remained impassive, inside, she felt embarrassed. Not remorseful, not yet, but humiliated. The looks from the other passengers still burned in her memory. She wasn't used to being the villain in a room. She'd always thought of herself as a good person, someone who paid her taxes, volunteered occasionally, and taught her children to be polite. But something about Marcus, his quiet confidence, his calm dignity, had unsettled her. He hadn't argued, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't played into her expectations. He'd simply been decent, and that decency, reflected against her prejudice, exposed her ugliness like a harsh light. Still, she clung to her justifications. It's not racism, it's just comfort. It's just preference. She told herself that lie because it was easier than facing the truth. Half an hour into the flight, turbulence began to shake the cabin gently. The fasten seatbelt sign lit up and the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of rough air ahead. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. A few nervous murmurs filled the cabin as the plane bounced lightly through the air currents. Marcus stayed calm, his hands resting loosely on his lap. Margaret, however, gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles whitening. The jolt of another air pocket made her gasp audibly. Without thinking, her hand instinctively reached toward Marcus's armrest and brushed against his hand. She froze instantly, realizing what she'd done. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply looked at her, his expression calm, almost reassuring. Their eyes met for the first time since she boarded the plane. For a moment, something shifted. Margaret felt the sting of shame crawl up her neck. The man she'd refused to sit beside was now the one radiating calm in her moment of fear. He gave a small nod, the kind that said, "It's okay, we'll be fine." She looked away quickly, pretending to adjust her seatbelt, but inside something cracked. It wasn't a full realization, not yet, but a hairline fracture in her certainty. She found herself sneaking a glance at him again, noticing details she hadn't before. The faint silver at his temples, the quiet confidence in his posture, the kindness in his eyes. He didn't fit the caricature her mind had drawn. He was simply a man, human, dignified, patient. And that truth unsettled her more than the turbulence. The shaking subsided after a few minutes, and the cabin relaxed again. Elena's voice came over the speaker, assuring everyone that the flight would smooth out soon. Margaret exhaled deeply, realizing she'd been holding her breath. She looked down at her hands and saw they were trembling slightly. Marcus noticed. He reached into his bag, pulled out a small packet of tissues, and quietly offered one to her. "In case you need it," he said softly. His voice was deep, gentle, not condescending, not forced. Margaret hesitated, her pride warring with her conscience, but finally she took it. "Thank you," she murmured, barely audible. He smiled faintly. "You're welcome." For the first time since the flight began, there was no tension between them, just a fragile, awkward silence that wasn't hostile but human. Margaret turned the tissue over in her hands, feeling its softness, her thoughts tangled. She didn't know how to apologize, or even if she could. She wasn't ready to admit, even to herself, that she'd been wrong. But something in her heart began to whisper a truth she couldn't ignore, that maybe, just maybe, she'd misjudged the man beside her, and in doing so, she'd revealed more about herself than she'd ever intended. As the plane cruised smoothly toward New York, the clouds outside glowed like soft white mountains beneath the sunlight. Inside, something quieter but equally powerful was happening. The slow, painful, necessary unlearning of prejudice. The hum of the engines had settled into a soft, steady drone that filled the cabin like background music, the kind that faded into thought. Most passengers were now absorbed in their own worlds, some reading, others dozing off, a few staring absently out at the endless blue horizon. But in row 14, the air still carried something more delicate, the fragile beginning of reflection. Margaret sat with the tissue Marcus had handed her still folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't used it, but somehow it had become a small symbol, a gesture of kindness that lingered far longer than she expected. For several minutes she wrestled with the silence between them, unsure whether to speak or let the moment dissolve. Her pride urged her to stay quiet, but her conscience whispered differently. Finally, she took a slow breath and turned slightly toward Marcus. "I suppose I owe you an apology," she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the steady hum of the aircraft. Marcus looked up from his book. His expression was calm, unreadable, but there was something gentle in his eyes, an openness that invited honesty. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. You didn't hurt me. Not really. Margaret blinked, surprised by his tone. She had expected defensiveness or perhaps a quiet reproach. But instead his voice carried only grace. No, she said after a pause, I did. Maybe not physically, but words, or gestures, they can wound, even if they're not spoken out loud. She looked down at her hands, fiddling with her wedding ring as she spoke. I've always thought of myself as decent, kind even. But when I saw you sitting here, I don't know. Something old, something ugly inside me spoke first. And I listened to it. Marcus closed his book and placed it in the seat pocket, giving her his full attention. It takes courage to admit that, he said. Most people don't. His voice was low and even, but it carried the kind of weight that came from experience, from years of living in a world that too often demanded patience from people who shouldn't have to prove their humanity. I grew up in a small town, he continued after a pause. Mostly white. My mom was a teacher, my dad a mechanic. Good people, hard workers. But every day they'd remind me, son, you'll have to be twice as good to get half as far. Back then I didn't really understand. I thought they were being pessimistic, but as I got older I saw what they meant. Sometimes you walk into a room and before you even speak, people have already decided who you are. Margaret listened, her eyes fixed on him now. The turbulence of her earlier emotions was slowly giving way to something steadier, remorse mixed with curiosity. That must be exhausting, she said quietly. Marcus smiled faintly, not bitterly, but knowingly. It can be. But I learned not to carry anger around with me. It's heavy, and the people who deserve it usually aren't the ones who feel it. He looked out the window briefly, the sunlight cutting across his face. The thing is, I don't expect everyone to understand my experience. I just hope for decency, for fairness. He turned back to her. That's all most people ever want, really. Margaret nodded slowly, her throat tightening. You're right, she murmured. Fairness. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a truth she hadn't spoken in a long time. You know, she said after a moment, my father was in the army. He was strict, proud, believed the world worked in simple rules. Good people get good things, bad people don't. But he also had ideas about who belonged where, about what kind of people you could trust. I never questioned it much. It was just the air we breathed back then. And even when the world changed, I guess part of me never did. Her voice trembled slightly, a mix of guilt and shame. It's strange. You can live your whole life thinking you're decent until someone holds up a mirror and you don't like what you see. Marcus didn't interrupt. He listened, really listened, the way people do when they've been waiting their whole lives for someone to finally understand. We all inherit something, he said after a moment. The question is whether we keep carrying it or set it down. He spoke simply, but his words landed with the quiet weight of truth. Margaret looked at him, her eyes glistening faintly. And I think I've been carrying mine for too long, she whispered. For a few minutes they both sat in silence, watching the light flicker across the clouds outside. The conversation had stripped away every layer of defense, leaving something raw but real between them. Margaret finally turned to him again. What do you do, if you don't mind me asking? She said, her tone gentler now. I'm a software engineer, Marcus replied. I work on developing ethical frameworks for artificial intelligence. Margaret raised her eyebrows, genuinely surprised. That sounds complicated. He chuckled softly. It is, but it's also about fairness, about teaching machines not to inherit the same biases people do. That made her smile faintly, almost ruefully. Maybe you should start with people instead of machines, she said. Marcus laughed quietly. Maybe, but one step at a time. For the first time since the plane had taken off, they both laughed, softly, genuinely. It wasn't forced or awkward. It was human. The sound of it, carried through the cabin air, felt like a small redemption. Elena, passing by to collect empty cups, glanced at them briefly and smiled. She didn't know what had been said, but she could sense the difference, the peace where tension had been. Margaret turned back toward the window, her voice almost a whisper. Thank you, she said, not looking at him but meaning every word. For being kind. I didn't deserve it. Marcus looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Kindness isn't about what someone deserves, he said softly. It's about what you choose to give. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. And inside row 14, something far rarer than a sunset had taken place. The quiet beginning of understanding between two strangers who, just hours earlier, had seemed separated by an ocean of difference. The hours in the air seemed to pass differently now, no longer weighed down by tension, but carried along by something gentler, almost redemptive. The steady hum of the engines had become a kind of rhythm beneath their conversation, a reminder that the world, for all its divisions, still moved forward. Margaret leaned slightly toward Marcus, her posture softer than before. Her face, once stiff with pride, now held something fragile and uncertain. Humility, perhaps, or the early glimmer of regret finally turning into understanding. "You know," she said quietly, "I've flown so many times before, but I don't think I've ever really seen the people sitting beside me. I just move through life, wrapped up in my own little world. Maybe that's part of the problem." Marcus smiled faintly. "Most people do," he said. "We get used to being comfortable, and comfort can make us blind." She nodded, absorbing his words. For the first time, she wasn't thinking of how to defend herself or how to justify her earlier actions. She was just listening. "My husband used to say that the world was changing too fast," she continued after a moment. "He'd grumble about technology, politics, even how people talk to each other. I think I agreed with him more than I realized. Maybe I started believing that change itself was the problem, instead of seeing that the real issue was me standing still." She chuckled softly, but it was a sad sound, one that carried years of unexamined truths. "He passed away 3 years ago," she added, her voice trembling slightly. "And since then, I suppose I've been clinging to what felt familiar, even when it was wrong." Marcus turned slightly toward her, empathy softening his expression. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely. "Losing someone changes everything. It can make the world seem smaller." She looked at him, surprised at how easily he understood. "It did," she admitted. "I withdrew. I stopped going to church, stopped visiting my sister. I just existed, and I didn't realize how much fear had taken root inside me until today. Fear of people, of change, of saying the wrong thing." She gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "And look where that fear got me, making a fool of myself in front of an entire airplane." Marcus shook his head gently. "It's not foolish to learn," he said. "It's brave. Most people go their whole lives without ever questioning themselves." He paused for a moment, glancing at the passengers around them. People asleep, reading, or staring out the window at the vastness of sky. "You know what's strange?" he continued. "We're all sitting here, thousands of feet above the earth, relying on a machine and a few people we've never met to keep us safe. We trust strangers with our lives every time we fly, and yet on the ground, we struggle to trust each other with the simplest things, like a seat beside us." His words hung in the air, quiet but piercing, the kind of truth that didn't need elaboration. Margaret's eyes welled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. "And yet, it feels like the hardest thing in the world." Marcus offered a gentle smile. "It is simple," he said, "but not easy." She laughed softly through her emotion. "That's a good way to put it." For a moment they sat in silence again, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but full of unspoken reflection. Margaret found herself studying his hands, steady, relaxed, resting on the book he'd set aside. She wondered what it must have been like for him to face prejudice all his life and yet still speak with such grace. "How do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "How do you stay so calm when people treat you unfairly?" Marcus exhaled slowly, thinking before he spoke. "Because I had to," he said. "Anger used to eat at me when I was younger. Every rude comment, every sideways look, it all built up. But I realized something. Every time I let someone else's hate control my peace, I was giving them power over me. And I can't live like that. I'd rather show them something different, something they don't expect." He glanced at her, his voice steady but soft. "People expect anger from me. When I choose calm, it unsettles them. It makes them see me, not their prejudice." Margaret nodded slowly, his words settling deep within her. "You must get tired of having to be the better person all the time," she said, her voice heavy with empathy. Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes distant for a moment. "Sometimes I do," he admitted. "But I remind myself that change doesn't happen when people shout each other down. It happens when one person chooses to be better, even when it's unfair that they have to be." He looked out the window, the fading sunlight casting a golden glow over his face. Kindness isn't weakness, he added quietly. It's strength in disguise. Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, to offer an apology that felt worthy, but every word seemed too small. So instead, she reached for the simplest truth she could find. I'm sorry, she said softly. Not just for what I did today, but for what I've carried in my heart for so long. For all the people I've judged without knowing them. For all the chances I've missed to be better. Her voice broke slightly, and she pressed the tissue he'd given her earlier to her eyes. I can't promise I'll get everything right from now on, she said. But I can promise I'll try. Marcus looked at her, and in that moment, there was no anger, no resentment, only a quiet recognition that healing had begun. That's all anyone can do, he said gently. Try. He offered her another tissue, and this time she laughed through her tears as she took it. The sound was warm, genuine, filled with a kind of freedom she hadn't felt in years. Around them, the cabin lights dimmed as the plane began its descent toward New York. Outside, the city glittered below like a constellation come to life. Margaret gazed out the window, watching the lights draw closer, her heart lighter than when she'd boarded. Somewhere between takeoff and landing, she had confronted not just her prejudice, but her humanity. And as the landing gear lowered with a soft mechanical hum, she realized that, for the first time in a long while, she was no longer afraid of sitting beside anyone. The seatbelt sign dinged on, the familiar announcement crackled through the speakers, and the plane began its slow descent through the soft evening haze over New York. The skyline glittered below like a scatter of jewels, each light flickering against the velvet dusk. Margaret felt the gentle pressure of gravity returning as the aircraft tilted downward, the engines humming in a low, controlled roar. She clutched her armrest, not out of fear this time, but from an odd surge of emotion she couldn't quite name. Something inside her had shifted during those few hours in the air. She had boarded the flight, angry, rigid, certain of her own decency. She was landing humbled, aware of how little she had really known about herself. Marcus glanced out the window, then back at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. Almost there, he said. Welcome to New York. She nodded, returning the smile with effort. It's funny, she murmured. Feels like a longer journey than just a couple of hours. The plane's wheels touched down with a gentle thud, followed by the rumble of deceleration and the passengers' collective exhale. Applause broke out from a few scattered seats, an old travel habit that never failed to make Marcus grin. Margaret found herself laughing softly, surprised by the lightness in her own voice. When the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, the captain thanked everyone for flying, and the cabin filled with the rustle of unbuckling seatbelts and the buzz of cell phones reconnecting to the ground. People stood, stretching, reclaiming bags from the overhead bins. The world outside awaited them. Meetings, reunions, ordinary lives. But for Margaret, stepping off this plane wouldn't feel ordinary at all. She turned to Marcus as he reached up to retrieve his carry-on. May I help you with that? She asked impulsively. He smiled, amused but touched. I've got it, he said. But thank you. She nodded, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. There had been a time, just hours ago, when she wouldn't even have offered. You mentioned you're speaking at a conference? She asked, her tone genuinely curious now. Yes, he said, slinging the strap of his bag over his shoulder. Tomorrow morning, actually. It's about how technology can mirror human bias, and how we can teach it not to. Margaret's eyes softened. Seems like you're already doing that without any computers involved. He chuckled quietly. Maybe so. As the line of passengers began to move forward, Elena, the flight attendant, reappeared near the front. Her expression relaxed into a smile when she saw them approaching side by side. Safe travels, she said to each passenger in turn, but when Marcus and Margaret reached her, she paused. Everything all right back here? She asked, her tone gentle but knowing. Margaret met her gaze squarely for the first time. More than all right, she said, her voice steady. Thank you for how you handled things earlier. Elena tilted her head slightly, surprised and pleased. I just did what anyone should, she replied. Not everyone would, Margaret said quietly. For a brief moment, the three of them stood there in an unspoken understanding, the witness, the offender, and the advocate, bound together by a lesson none of them would forget. Then the line behind them nudged forward and the spell broke. Stepping onto the jet bridge, Margaret inhaled the warm, slightly stale airport air as though it were something new. Travelers hurried past with rolling luggage, flight numbers echoed over the speakers, and somewhere nearby a child laughed. The world was ordinary again, but she felt changed. She walked beside Marcus through the terminal, neither rushing nor awkward. "You know," she said after a moment, "I was thinking about what you said, about choosing calm instead of anger." "That's harder than it sounds." "It's a practice," he replied. "Like any habit, you just start choosing better, even when it feels uncomfortable." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's what I'll do. Start choosing better." At the baggage carousel, they waited together as suitcases thumped onto the belt in a slow parade of colors and handles. Margaret's bag appeared first, a modest gray case with a red ribbon tied to the handle. Marcus reached out and lifted it down for her before she could protest. "Thank you," she said again, meaning more than just the gesture. "For everything," he shrugged lightly. "We both learned something today," he said. "You about people like me and me about people like you. What could you possibly have learned from me?" She asked, half teasing, half genuinely curious. "That people can change," he said simply. "That's worth remembering." She felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time they were warm, not shameful. "You're a good man, Mr. Bryant. And you're not as bad as you think, Mrs. Hensley," he replied with a grin. They both laughed, the sound echoing faintly over the carousel's mechanical clatter. When his bag arrived, he lifted it off and extended a hand. She took it, shaking firmly. "Safe travels," she said. "You too," he replied, "and good luck with choosing better." They parted there, two strangers who had entered the sky as opposites and landed as something closer to equals. Margaret watched him disappear into the crowd, his stride confident yet unhurried, and for a moment she simply stood still, absorbing everything. Around her, people hurried past in their separate orbits, unaware that a quiet miracle had just unfolded between gate and ground. She realized, with a small smile, that she was seeing them differently now, not as categories or threats, but as stories she hadn't heard yet. As she walked toward the exit, the loudspeaker announced another boarding call, another wave of travelers heading skyward. Margaret paused, glancing back through the wide airport window where a plane was taxiing into the sunset. The light reflected off the glass and caught her face, and she thought of Marcus's words. Kindness isn't weakness, it's strength in disguise. For the first time in years, she felt that strength stirring inside her, quiet but real. She picked up her suitcase, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward into the evening crowd. Not as the woman who refused to sit beside a stranger, but as the woman who finally learned how to see one. The next morning dawned gray and quiet. The kind of November morning that seemed caught between seasons. Too cold for autumn, too mild for winter. Margaret stood at the window of her small hotel room in Manhattan, staring down at the street below. Yellow taxis streamed past like bright fish in a gray river, and the faint smell of roasted coffee drifted up from a cart on the corner. She had slept restlessly, her dreams looping back to the hum of the airplane, the steady voice of Marcus, and her own reflection in the window somewhere over the clouds. It had been only 12 hours since they'd parted at the baggage carousel, yet she felt as though years had passed. The world outside looked the same, but she was different. After a moment, she turned from the window and reached for the hotel's little coffee maker. The machine sputtered to life, and she let its sound fill the silence. As she waited, her thoughts wandered to Marcus's words. Choosing better is a practice. He'd said it so simply, yet it had lodged deep in her mind. For most of her life, Margaret had seen kindness as a matter of politeness, something to be done when convenient. But now she realized kindness was more like a muscle, one that grew only through effort, discomfort, and repetition. She thought of all the moments she had stayed silent when she could have spoken, looked away when she could have seen, judged when she could have understood. The coffee dripped steadily into the small paper cup, the dark liquid swirling like her thoughts. By the time she left the hotel, the city was alive with movement. People hurried along the sidewalks, clutching coats against the chill. Margaret walked slower than most, her steps deliberate. She wasn't due to meet her niece until noon, but she wanted to explore, wanted to practice, as Marcus had said. She stopped first at a corner cafe, a small, bustling place filled with people of every kind. Office workers tapping on laptops, construction workers in reflective vests, mothers soothing toddlers. A young barista greeted her with a bright smile. "Morning. What can I get started for you?" Margaret hesitated for a heartbeat. She wasn't used to being addressed so warmly by someone so young. But then she smiled back. "Just a black coffee, please." The barista nodded, called out the order, and moved efficiently to the espresso machine. When he handed her the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt the warmth of genuine connection in that small, ordinary exchange. She found a seat by the window and sat quietly, watching the life of the city unfold. At the next table sat a young woman in a hijab, scrolling through her phone. Across the room, an older man with a Caribbean accent laughed with a friend. None of it was extraordinary, yet it felt to Margaret as if the world had opened its curtain a little wider, showing her the full cast she'd been too blind to see before. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting herself feel both gratitude and shame. The gratitude for seeing clearly, the shame for how long it had taken. Around mid-morning, she noticed a commotion near the counter. A delivery driver, rushed and frustrated, was arguing with the barista about a missing order. The man's voice was raised, his accent thick, his gestures sharp with exhaustion. Other customers began to stare, whispering. The barista, flustered, apologized, but seemed unsure what to do. For a moment, Margaret sat frozen. This wasn't her problem, her mind whispered. But another voice, quieter and stronger, reminded her of a man's calm voice on an airplane. "It's not foolish to learn, it's brave." She rose from her seat and stepped closer. "Excuse me," she said gently to the driver. "I think the barista is trying to help. Maybe it's just a mix-up." The man turned toward her, his expression still tense, but her tone seemed to soften him. The barista quickly checked the order slip again, found the missing bag, and handed it over. The driver muttered a quick thanks before hurrying out. The cafe returned to its normal rhythm, but the barista looked at Margaret with relief. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't know what to do." She smiled faintly. Sometimes people just need someone to meet them halfway. As she returned to her seat, she felt her heart beating fast. Not from fear, but from the quiet thrill of doing something she wouldn't have done before. It wasn't heroic, not really, but it was something. It was better. Later that afternoon, Margaret met her niece Claire for lunch. Claire was in her 30s, brisk and busy, full of city confidence that both impressed and intimidated her aunt. Over salads and iced tea, they talked about family, work, the weather. Eventually, Claire mentioned a diversity training seminar at her office, rolling her eyes. "Honestly, it feels performative," she said. "People just say what they think HR wants to hear." Margaret listened quietly, then said, "Maybe it's not about what we say in those rooms. Maybe it's about how we act afterward." Claire blinked, surprised by her aunt's sudden seriousness. "That's actually a good point," she admitted. Margaret smiled faintly. "I used to think those things didn't matter either. But I was wrong." She didn't elaborate further. She didn't need to. When they parted, the sun was setting behind the buildings, the sky painted gold and rose. Margaret walked slowly toward Central Park, her heart calm and steady. She watched people pass, a jogger, a street musician, a couple walking hand in hand. For the first time, she felt herself part of the same current instead of standing apart from it. As the wind rustled through the bare branches above, she thought of Marcus again, of his patience, his strength, his quiet dignity. She wondered if he was speaking at his conference right now, sharing his message of fairness and empathy. And she hoped that somewhere, he knew the ripple he had left behind. Standing at the edge of the park, Margaret whispered softly to herself, "Keep choosing better." The words felt like both a prayer and a promise. Then she turned toward the streetlights flickering to life, the city's hum wrapping around her like a heartbeat. The journey she had begun in the sky was far from over, but for the first time in a long, long while, she was ready to walk it with open eyes. The following day dawned brisk and silver, sunlight breaking through the last traces of dawn fog. Margaret stood outside the hotel lobby, suitcase beside her, waiting for a taxi to take her to Penn Station. Her trip was almost over. Soon she'd be back home in Virginia, in her quiet neighborhood with its tidy lawns and familiar routines. Yet something inside her hesitated. The city's energy had gotten under her skin, its diversity, its noise, its relentless motion. For the first time, she didn't feel overwhelmed by it. She felt part of it. She thought of Marcus again, wondering if his conference had gone well. Maybe somewhere in the same city, he was standing in front of a crowd, sharing the kind of wisdom that had changed her life in just a few hours. She smiled at the thought, then adjusted her scarf as a cab pulled to the curb. The driver, a middle-aged man with a faint African accent, stepped out to help her with her luggage. "Penn Station?" he asked politely. "Yes, thank you," she said, sliding into the back seat. As the car pulled into traffic, she watched the city glide by, the endless mix of faces, the blend of languages, the unspoken choreography of urban life. It struck her again how easily she'd once reduced people to categories instead of individuals. Each person she saw now seemed to hold an entire world behind their eyes. The thought filled her with a deep, almost aching humility. They were halfway to the station when the car slowed at a red light. On the sidewalk, a small crowd was gathered near a convenience store. Curious, Margaret leaned forward, peering through the window. A young black man, maybe 20, wearing a backpack, was being confronted by an older white woman in a beige coat. The woman's voice carried even through the closed windows, sharp and accusing. Margaret couldn't make out every word, but she caught phrases like, "I saw you take it," and "call the police." The boy's hands were raised, his voice calm but tight. "Ma'am, I didn't take anything," he was saying. "I just came in to buy gum." The taxi driver frowned, shaking his head. "Always something," he muttered softly. Margaret felt her stomach knot. The scene outside might have been ordinary to the passers-by, but to her it felt uncomfortably familiar, like a mirror held up to her past self. The woman's posture, her tone, the certainty in her voice, it was Margaret, just 2 days ago, on that plane. Except this time, she was on the outside looking in. The light turned green, and the driver started to move forward, but Margaret surprised herself by saying, "Could you pull over, please?" The driver looked back, confused. "Ma'am?" "Just for a moment," she said firmly. He nodded, guiding the taxi to the curb. Before she could second-guess herself, Margaret opened the door and stepped out. The air was sharp with cold and her heart pounded, but she walked toward the crowd anyway. By now, a store clerk had appeared at the door looking anxious. "Ma'am," he said to the woman, "I checked the camera. He didn't take anything. You dropped your wallet yourself." The woman hesitated, her face flushing red. The boy exhaled, shoulders loosening slightly. But Margaret could see how everyone's eyes were still on him, suspicion lingering in the air even after he'd been proven innocent. It wasn't over, not really. Margaret took a breath and stepped closer. "Excuse me," she said to the older woman, her voice gentle but firm. "I think this young man deserves an apology." The woman turned sharply, startled. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Just someone who's made a similar mistake," Margaret replied evenly. "And I learned that saying sorry is the least you can do when you've judged someone unfairly." Her tone was calm, but her heart raced. The crowd murmured softly, their attention shifting. The woman glanced around, embarrassed, then muttered, "Fine, I'm sorry." She didn't meet the boy's eyes. Margaret didn't press further. She knew that change couldn't be forced. But she turned to the young man and smiled warmly. "I'm sorry too," she said quietly, "for how often this must happen." He looked at her, surprised, then nodded slightly. "Thank you," he said. His voice was cautious, but there was gratitude in it. The tension dissolved a little. The crowd began to drift away. As Margaret walked back toward the cab, she felt her pulse steady. She wasn't proud, not exactly, but she felt something better. Peace. She had stepped into discomfort, into a moment that could have gone wrong, and chosen differently. It wasn't heroic or grand. It was human, and that, she realized, was the point. Marcus had told her that kindness wasn't weakness, it was strength in disguise. Now she understood what he meant. Kindness took courage. When she slid back into the taxi, the driver gave her a curious look in the mirror. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he asked. She nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. "It is," she said. "It really is." The driver chuckled. "You helped, didn't you?" She hesitated, then said, "I tried." He nodded approvingly. "Trying is good. The world needs more people who try." His words echoed Marcus's almost perfectly, and Margaret felt her chest tighten with emotion. As the taxi pulled away, she looked out the window again, the city glimmering in the morning light. For the first time in her life, she understood that redemption wasn't a single act. It was a daily choice. The choice to see people as human, the choice to stand up when it was easier to stay silent, the choice to be kind, even when the world wasn't. When the taxi reached Penn Station, Margaret paid the fare and thanked the driver sincerely. As she walked toward the entrance, she felt light, not because she was free from guilt, but because she was finally using it for something good. She paused at the top of the escalator, looked back once more at the crowded street, and whispered to herself, "Keep choosing better." Then she descended into the flow of travelers below, a single person in a sea of faces, her heart open, her spirit steady, and her journey, both literal and moral, far from over. When Margaret returned home to Virginia 2 days later, the familiar stillness of her house greeted her like an old habit. The white clapboard siding, the neat row of hedges, the wind chime by the porch, all of it was exactly as she'd left it. But somehow it all felt smaller now. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood for a long moment in the quiet. The trip had changed her, but the walls didn't know that yet. They still held the echoes of the woman who had left, the one who lived safely within her comfort, who rarely questioned herself or the world around her. But the woman who had returned was different, and she knew it wouldn't take long before that difference was tested. She didn't have to wait long. The next afternoon, her brother Frank came over for lunch, as he did every few weeks. He was 2 years older, a retired police officer with a booming laugh, and the kind of certainty that filled every room he entered. Margaret had always admired his confidence, but today she found herself uneasy even before he arrived. She brewed coffee and set out sandwiches, reminding herself to stay open, calm, kind. When Frank's pickup truck rumbled into the driveway, she smoothed her sweater and went to meet him at the door. "There's my little sister," he said warmly, pulling her into a hug that smelled faintly of aftershave and motor oil. "How is New York?" "Still full of crazy people." Margaret smiled faintly, choosing her words with care. "It was enlightening," she said. "Met some good people." Frank chuckled as he hung up his jacket. "You always meet characters in that city. Half of them think they're saving the world." He followed her to the kitchen table, plopping down with the comfortable authority of someone who never expected to be challenged. They ate and talked about small things at first, neighbors, weather, football. But when the conversation drifted toward air travel, as it inevitably would, Frank leaned back with a grin. "You know me," he said. "I always pay the extra for an aisle seat. I can't stand being crammed next to some stranger, especially when you never know who you'll get these days."